Thank you, Carl. That was fantastic, and it actually was a really good introduction to our first panel of the day. So for this first panel, we're going to put our current political moment in context. What does it look like when we consider journalism and science in the context of history? How are we training new journalists and writers for the future? And why are journalism and science important in a democracy anyway? To guide us through these questions and more, I'd like to introduce our first moderator of the day, Mariette Kristina, who is editor-in-chief of Scientific American.
It's my charge to help expand on some of the principles that we heard about a little earlier today, including what Carl just mentioned, and I'm sort of reflecting on a couple of the things that he just said, that history can familiarize us and it can warn us about things, and that we ought to take a little time to read about it. So maybe one way to start to think about this panel, which is on science, journalism, and democracy, and we're going to take a bit of a sweeping view of history, is what lessons we can learn about that, how we can think about what's going on today in the light of a sort of a deeper dive in that. And before I introduce the panelists, just would like to mention a quick historical touchstone of my own, or at least it was historical for me. On the election day, I happened to be in Berlin. I was attending a conference called Falling Walls, which was held right near where the old Berlin Wall used to be. And the purpose of that conference was to celebrate the free exchange of science information and ideas. And I watched live, it was 9 a.m. there, the president accept what the vote looked like at the time. And I just had a moment where I was listening to what was happening in real time, but I was also in a place where I had the benefit of a view of history. And the first thing that happened was a colleague of mine from Germany came by and kissed me on both cheeks and said, we're all here for you here, and we'll all just keep talking together. And I took great hope and inspiration from that. So I just want to suggest to us that we're about to learn from these wonderful panelists some really helpful insights. And I hope that while we draw some cautionary tales, we also draw some inspiration and some hope from them. So this panel, as I mentioned, is going to talk about science, journalism, and democracy. We're going to take a look at 3 dimensions. We're going to look first at a historic perspective, and we have some wonderful historians on the panel here who've studied these areas and can talk to us a little bit about how do we get here? What are the long threads of time? We heard about Lysenko and other things this morning. We're going to go back even a little farther from some of our panelists. We'll also then take a look at some lessons learned and how, what are some interesting things people are doing today to respond to the challenges and turn them into opportunities, perhaps. And take a look at the future. What can we expect next? What are ways we might think about going forward? And after about, rough give or take, 20 minutes or so on each of those areas, I will come to you all about the top of the hour and ask you for questions. I'd love it if, when you do that, just as you did before when speaking with Carl, you just say your name and kind of where you're coming from before you ask your question, just so we have a better sense of it and can do a good job at answering it. And I'm going to ask the panelists, a little hard because I'm so short, to just lift your hand when I give your name and a couple of quick words about you. It's not going to be in order because I'm just trying to make sure I do this properly, and so I'm going to have to look down. Apologize for that. So directly to my right here and your left is Dan Fagan, who is director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program at New York University and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of a wonderful book called Tom's River, A Story of Science and Salvation. I think that's Lisa Geidelman to his right, professor of media and English at New York University. Lisa teaches in the departments of English and of media, culture, and communications at NYU. And she's author most recently of Paper Knowledge by Duke University Press and editor of Raw Data is an Oxymoron by MIT Press. And then I think, is that Michael? Michael Halpern, I'm just meeting now. Nice to meet you, Deputy Director of the Center for Science and Democracy, who works to promote solutions that ensure government decisions are fully informed by scientific information, that the public understands the scientific basis for those decisions at Union of Concerned Scientists. And then I see Sarah Scholler. Am I saying that right? Jossam, thank you. Jossam, thank you so much. Sarah Jossam please forgive me, senior lecturer in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And last not least is Robert Snyder, professor of journalism and American studies at Rutgers University in Newark. And I just want to say one quick thing on Rob's behalf. Unfortunately, because a scheduling commitment he has today, he has to leave at about 11. So I just don't want everybody to think he's disgusted with the conversation, has to go. So anyway, I promised you all that we would take a deeper dive into a bit of history, and it just occurs to me that it might help to start with some definitions. The premise of this panel, as Brooke had outlined it to me, is that science and journalism are critical supports in a functioning democracy, and I thought it might be useful for everybody just to refresh ourselves on what are some of those key ingredients and how does science and journalism play important roles. Maybe Michael would be good to start with you and some of the thoughts that you shared with me about how transparency and so on.
Sure, and it's really great to be here and be with you. I think scientists and journalists share a lot of the same kinds of ideals of trying to separate noise from truth, and can really work together in a lot of ways to make that happen. One of the questions you posed at the beginning are we at a unique moment in time? Are we in a space that's different? And I think it is important to acknowledge that science has been politicized by all modern presidents dating back to World War II. That when scientific facts get in the way of the types of policies that people want to put forward, there tends to be an urge to sweep that aside. But there are things that are different in this current political arena. What's different is that there is the stated objective of the deconstruction of the administrative state by now departed presidential advisor Steve Bannon, which is being realized by a lot of the people who are inside of federal agencies now. A lot of that so-called administrative state consists of the executive branch actually applying the laws, the science-based laws that Congress has passed. So there's a pretty significant disconnect there, and it makes it more likely that science will be politicized. What's different is that a lot of members of Congress have been attacking individual scientists or individual science grants or individual reporters for a number of years, as have a lot of think tanks that are funded by different entities and different interests to try to cast doubt on purveyors of the truth and try to undermine scientific consensus. That's now moved within the executive branch. So we saw over the weekend the Associated Press fact-checking the EPA on whether or not it could get to contaminated Superfund sites, finding that they were able to walk to them or boat to them when the EPA was saying that these sites were inaccessible. And the EPA responded by putting out an attack on that particular AP journalist who was writing that piece and breaking that piece of news. So it's now moved within government. You have the Department of Energy tweeting that Rick Perry is taking on the scientists, and this is kind of a state that we haven't seen before. So the threat level has escalated, and fortunately the response has been equally strong from the science community and from those who are in civil society that care about these issues.
Thank you. Lisa, I wonder if I might turn to you. You spoke to me a little bit about the search for objectivity and truth, which are common to both journalism and science, and how they may differ a little bit and feed into a working democracy.
Sure, thanks. It's great to be here, everybody. I feel a little out of place as not a journalist, not a policy or political scientist, and certainly not a scientist. I study media history, so I can offer some kind of abstract thoughts, I guess, on this question of where we are today and to give another cheer for historical inquiry. I think it is clear that we are in a very unique moment in lots of different ways. But I guess part of my stock in trade is saying that there are also important historical parallels that we need to be attentive to, and we certainly had an example of that with Carl's great talk. At a more kind of abstract level about science and journalism, though, I think it's probably good to remember that neither of them are kind of monolithic or, in fact, ancient formations, nor are they stable in time. And one of the things that the stuff I read is interested in is some historical parallels from the late 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries when an explosive, dynamic, new media form helped in certain ways to jeopardize authorities of all kinds. I'm thinking here of the print media starting in the late 17th century maybe, but then certainly in the kind of explosive new periodical press of the early 19th century. I think that science and certainly journalism are both formations of that kind of dynamic change. Science earlier than journalism, the scientific disciplines following on that, but to see the disciplines and the professions as themselves kind of changeable and born out of a kind of crucible of changing media landscapes is, I think, useful to think in terms of them now as in a powerful dynamic. And of course, we care desperately about their preservation and their ongoing formation in the interests of democracy. But to be attentive, I think, to catalysts and to changes is helpful as we go forward.
Thank you. Sarah, I wonder if we might follow on with you and some of your thinking about how things have evolved since the late 1800s, for instance.
Yes, so my background is a kind of mixed background from being trained initially as a scientist, as an ecologist, and then entering into the field of history of science. And one of the perspectives, as Lisa pointed out, comes from historical inquiry, is seeing episodic rises of hysteria of one sort or another over time, and recognizing that there are some interesting lessons from the past to look at. And so I would caution people to not put science on this pedestal of being solely objective, as though scientists are all working towards a common end with no underlying values or goals other than objectivity. It's not to question the authority in a pejorative way, but it is to question the motivations underlying the inquiries that we make as society. So, for instance, we have produced in the United States remarkable amounts of science under the program of land-grant universities to foster a certain kind of agriculture. It doesn't mean that it's the only kind of agriculture that we should consider, but there was definitely a character to that endeavor, and scientists did very good work within that larger mandate to provide economic engine for their individual states, for their citizens. And so that's one thing that to recognize that science is deployed in many different ways, and objectivity needs to be thought about carefully. The other thing is that science is provisional, and I think a lot of people do not recognize that that is not a weakness, but in fact a strength. And so having vigorous debates among scientists and having that shown to the public is critical for better understanding of how the world works. Unfortunately, once again, people tend to, general citizens, worry that if you do not have an emphatic corner on truth of objective science, that somehow that is a weakness. And instead, understanding more about the science will help citizens understand more about what they can draw from that and how it can manifest in their lives. So my area of research is institutions, scientific institutions, and as a measure of optimism for today, I'll bring up that we tend to worry at the level of individuals, but institutions can end up having a longer imprint upon our perceptions of the world. And many of them, and I refer to the Union of Concerned Scientists being one that is being pretty nimble about addressing some of these contemporary concerns by journalists and citizens.
I'd like to probe just a little bit more. So we've laid out some of the things I think that we have in common among scientists, among journalists, a search for objective truth, let's call it. A certain level of authority conveyed by facts and evidence, a provisional nature of things for which we're all open further to change. But it occurs to me, I meant to ask Lisa something in setting up the arc of history, and then I'd like to kind of go from Lisa, Sarah, maybe then you, Rob, about the things that you all had raised to me in describing the journey from there to here. So Lisa, you raised some seeds back in the Enlightenment. Sarah, you picked it up in the 1880s. Rob, you started in 1945 and up. And I'd actually think it would really, if you don't mind, it would really benefit everybody if they could just hear what you observe between journalism, science, and then over time. Then I'd like to come to Dan to talk about the kind of last couple of decades, immediate seeds of what we're seeing now. Could we do that? Could you kick us off, Lisa, about how does the Enlightenment help feed into what happened today?
Well, I was talking in these abstract terms about the disciplines, the modern disciplines, and I think the modern research university, like the encyclopedia, are kind of products of the Enlightenment in powerful ways that index the kinds of changes that help index the kinds of changes I was thinking about. I guess I didn't say maybe as succinctly that I might have, but Sarah was kind of picking up on this, that objectivity itself has a kind of history. We could historicize different ways of knowing in different scientific disciplines and see that objectivity has what counts as objectivity in the sciences, but also certainly in journalism, has changed over time. That's not necessarily bad. What it does is it points us to the growth of institutions, the growth of disciplines, to normative practices that communities of experts share and develop in common. And it's that commonality among experts that's so key to see as the background to the histories we're pointing to.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on that point and think about the world of journalism since 45 to the present, because I think journalism both shapes its times and is shaped by its times. And the American journalism of 1945 to the present is shaped powerfully by a couple of things. One is the rise and then the end of the Cold War as an organizing principle in American journalism. I think that for better and often for worse, American journalists calibrated their reporting about the rest of the world along the perspectives of the United States and the Cold War. And in those reports, they often deferred to the elites in Washington, D.C., in a kind of stenographic journalism that didn't interrogate what the government was doing, but instead repeated what the government was doing. That changed in the 60s and 70s. That changed in Watergate. Watergate is the great example of the Washington Post, and to a lesser degree the New York Times, severely questioning a president in a way that exposed tremendous corruption. But journalists did not achieve that by themselves. They did that initially at the Post, and the Post was brave and vulnerable in the beginning on Watergate. But later on, the courts and the Congress investigated the Nixon administration, and it's really the press plus the courts and Congress that brought justice to a very corrupt situation. I think today we're in a very different place. The Republicans' war on the press, which dates to the 1960s, is now about 50 years old. The vilification of science journalists has its precedents in vilification of political journalists. The major news media institutions, like the Times and the Post, who I think have done heroic work, are economically and institutionally in a very different place from where they were back then. And the political landscape is very different as well. The polarization between Democrats and Republicans creates a very different world that receives the news very differently and acts on it in different ways. And finally, the media landscape is really very different in television. The decline of the networks and the rise of Fox News have also created a much more complicated media landscape that puts the work of journalists in a very different context from the time of Watergate. So though I think that the Post and The Times have done great work in the tradition of the model of professional journalism that flowered in the 1970s, but the media landscape around them has changed dramatically. The political landscape has changed dramatically in ways that are not good for journalism and, frankly, democracy.
Dan, this starts to take us up to where we are today, where things have continued, it seems to me, to accelerate the change over time.
Okay, hi everybody. It's good to be here as the fake academic on the panel. Since we're going to be talking about fake news, that fits. I'm Lysenko-ish in my academic affiliations. Yet, like Lysenko, I've managed to make it work for a while. I'm really a journalist, and I have lived this transition that Robert and others have already spoken about, and that you all have been living as working science journalists, both junior, middle, and senior in your careers. So I do think it's really important to think about, to understand the sort of baseline secular trends that are happening in our business, and then to try to, on top of that, layer the sort of what is really new, what's different, if anything, about what Trump is doing, both in his handling of science issues and his handling of the press. So as many people have already pointed out, we've been in this sort of long, agonizing, somewhat agonizing, challenging, exciting transition to digital platforms for news and communication. And as it was happening, especially early on, I think a number of us, really most of us, did not really realize just how sort of epic that transformation would be. We thought, well, okay, we'll just cut and paste, the stuff that we put on print, define, cut, paste online, and everyone will read our stuff, and we'll continue to enjoy this sort of special privilege that brings in large advertising revenue and allows journalism to flourish. We didn't take into account that when you change technologies, unexpected, sometimes unanticipatable things happen. The way that people consume information changes dramatically. It becomes much more democratized. Beyond that, our advertisers, who we all were relying on for all this revenue, suddenly had metrics that they could consult. They had much better data about the effectiveness of their advertising when accompanying our journalism. And what they learned told them that, hey, this is really not a very good use of our advertising dollar, which is why we talk about print dollars to digital pennies. There is certainly advertising revenue online, but it's generally a fraction of what it had been under the print models. Beyond that, since the way that people are consuming information has changed, in general, their attitude toward authority of all sorts, but certainly journalism in particular, they've gotten less trusting, more cynical. And my own view is that of all the destructive things that have happened over the last year and a half since Donald Trump became a sort of a national political figure, this trust gap in journalism might be one of the most destructive, but it comes on top of this longer secular decline in public trust. So, what that means for us as science journalists and journalists in general is that we're really caught in a series of dilemmas and a series of really tough choices between trying to cope with these serious economic problems that we face that require us to aggregate large audiences at relatively low cost, and which obviously creates some real difficulties in doing good journalism. At the same time, if we succumb to those economic pressures, our journalism becomes more shallow, less accountable, less transparent, and therefore creates bigger trust problems for us. We've got a specific problem in science journalism too, that Trump in particular has has magnified, and that is that big advantage that we have as science journalism is that our work is rooted in the scientific process, which means that there's a kind of an arrogance, confidence that we bring to our work that says, hey, this really is the very best that civilization can tell us right now about this particular topic. And the big role of science journalism is to bring that sort of understanding of what is the consensus view, where is the weight of the evidence, to bring that into our stories and to really argue for them, argue for that same principle throughout journalism. But again, the more we do that, the more we run the risk of seeming very haughty, very sort of talking down to people and saying, we know what's right because we understand the weight of the evidence and you don't. So to go forward, for us, we have to sort of be aware of this sort of series of traps and sort of how do we deal with blatant falsehood? How do we bring the scientific process into our stories while at the same time expressing empathy and understanding to the people who don't share our depth of knowledge? So this is sort of a whole series of Star Trek style traps and dilemmas that we need to really think carefully about. And maybe I'll stop here for now, but I think there are lots of things that we can do to navigate this sort of series of traps that these secular trends and then the specifics of what Trump is doing have sort of laid for us as science journalists.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I mean, I actually think that that's an excellent transition point. So in the first 20, 25 minutes or so, we've been learning about the arc of time here, how we have started from an explosion of different disciplines to, Rob there was talking about an almost stenographer-like relationship in the 40s to a more start to challenge the authority relationship later, pioneered in the 60s and 70s, and that there's been an ongoing Republican war on the press, and indeed recently called, again, enemies of the state, which is kind of a funny feeling for those of us who feel like what we're trying to do is be anything but enemies of the state, but fostering and supporting a democratic society and the free exchange of ideas. And we heard about an increasing polarization in politics, and increasing diversification and a series of challenges in the media landscape from a variety of different platforms. I mean, I sometimes say to people, in many ways, we can say that there's a larger audience of eyes on scientific information and communication maybe than ever, but there's also a 24/7 sea of things that are not valuable that are out there and equally available to the things that we're providing as journalists and scientists. And that maybe some of what's new and different about what we're seeing today is the attitude against what we're trying to do, and also an attitude about what scientists and journalists are doing, that the public generally a bit less trusting of journalists in general, but maybe still a bit more trusting of scientists, and that's an opportunity I'd like to come back to, and that the journalism generally is caught in, and I think Dan put it well here, a series of dilemmas. There are economic problems working against it. Michael, you talked to me a little bit about how it makes a difference that there's less training available now, and often when you're answering questions, you realize you have to stop and give people additional information because they don't even know what peer review is. That really kind of struck me.
Yeah, well, it's everyone's expected to do more with less. It's the scientists, the journalists, it's all of us, and so. We don't have as many Carl Zimmers or Andy Revkins or others today, and that is a challenge because when you go to J school, you don't necessarily get trained in the scientific method, we've had a lot of conversations with the reporters, more increasingly so, just kind of getting people up to speed on how science works and how uncertainty works and what are the nuances that you have to kind of understand to be able to report responsibly and knowledgeably on science.
In some J schools you do, I'll just point out.
What's that?
In some J
Yes.
schools you do.
Well, so noted. But then when you get out into the reporting world, the time to really understand that nuance can be much more of a luxury than it used to be, and being able to is exacerbated by sort of the tension that's been in the science community for a long time, and that scientists, they're happy places where there's uncertainty. They're so excited when they are trying to find what questions are out there. And policymakers and politicians and the public want certainty. They want to know what's clear. They want to know what's now. And so that has always been something that we've had to navigate. But it is really important for us to have that baseline of understanding of what conflicts of interests are and how to report on them, and maybe not to quote sources when they won't disclose where their funding comes from, and so on and so forth.
I thought that was a really great example too. That's not for scientists. The happy place is uncertainty because they love a new puzzle. I remember a Nobel laureate kind of whinging to me a little bit about the possibility that they'd identified the Higgs boson, because if they found that, then that was almost disappointing. I thought that was interesting, and I would like to get back to the ideas. So Carl mentioned, the Star Wars character said, let's avoid, it's a trap. And then Dan outlined a series of potential traps, Star Trek-like traps. And by the way, Star Trek fan, I'm happy to hear those. And I'd like to talk about how, next, so having come up to today, what do we do about falsehoods? Who are addressing those in interesting ways and handling that? How do we bring the scientific process into story without overwhelming people with detail, 800-page reports and so on? And how do we start to grapple with those trends? What advice can each of you give to the people in the audience and the ones who are watching online to how do we deal with this? Dan, would you maybe like to start us off?
Okay, sure. Oh, I'm sorry, did you say Dan or somebody else?
Dan,
Yeah,
I did, sorry.
Yeah, that's me. I'm Dan. Yeah, thank you for that softball right down the middle of the plate. I have lots of advice about that. Many of my current and former students are here, and they've heard me drone on about this, and they have many good ideas of their own. One of the most important, I think, for science journalists in particular, is that we are always told quite correctly that we want to build narratives. Because we know from the best psychological research that the best way to give information to somebody in a way that is most likely to resonate with them is to do it in the form of a story, and I endorse that fully. But that is yet another trap in the sense that if we let our narratives drive our work, we can get ourselves into a fix, sort of like remember the UVA rape story that Rolling Stone did. That reporter was enamored of a really powerful narrative, and there was only one problem with that narrative, and it turned out to be significantly at variance from our best sense of what the facts were of the case. And that was not, the reporter and her editors did not do sufficient. Were somewhat blinded because they were so captured by the power of their narrative. So the first piece of advice I think that is really relevant for science journalists and all journalists is to begin with data. Don't end with data. Don't find your narrative and then say, okay, I need to find some data to support this narrative. That's backwards. You begin your work with narrative. You begin your work with data. You try to understand what is the key piece of information that you want to tell the world that the world may not really fully appreciate. Maybe it runs counter to what's previously known. Maybe it's confirmation. It's really important to do confirmation work too. But whatever it is, it needs to be sound, and you need to be transparent with readers about how confident or unconfident you are about this sort of core piece of empirical information that you're transmitting. And then Then you go out and you look for your story. And far too often I see people doing that backwards. And I think that that is one of the many things that contributes to this credibility gap that we face. Science's gift to journalism is data, and science journalism's gift to journalism as a whole is narrative based on data. And we need to keep fighting for that despite many pressures to the contrary.
I'd love to turn to Rob and Sarah, maybe for things you've observed through the course of time that may offer some object lessons for dealing with the events today. Past approaches people have taken, journalists or scientists, to reach the public, to convey a message.
I mean, one thing I would say, and my training as an academic is in history. I have a PhD in history. And a very smart historian named Steve Breyer once said to me, it's easier to turn a good historian into a documentary filmmaker than it is to take a documentary filmmaker and make them a good historian. And I would sort of put the same idea before science journalists. If you know some basic things about science, you can then become a journalist far more effectively than would otherwise be the case. I don't know if it's still true, but I remember when the NYU Science Journalism Program was founded, when I was in grad school at NYU, the requirement is you had to have an undergraduate degree in science. How reasonable, how smart. You know, there are other ways to become a science journalist without getting that undergraduate degree, for sure. But at the same time, a basic grounding in the facts of what you cover is tremendously useful, because it helps you, one, discipline your own work, but it gives you a stronger sense of analyzing what other people are doing and writing. You can see through the baloney in false scientific research far more effectively, just as I can read through the baloney in false historical narratives that say that slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War. This is simply not the case, and it's fairly settled among historians that slavery did have a big role in bringing on the Civil War. All you have to do is look at the Ordinance of Secession that all the Southern states signed when they left the Union. They were leaving to defend slavery. Anybody who wants to argue otherwise has to walk away from them. And those ordinances were passed overwhelmingly in the states. Anybody who wants to say that's not the case is really arguing uphill against all the evidence. But it's only if you have a knowledge of the history and a knowledge of the historical method that you can, as a journalist, make the case that brings the best analysis of history, as science journalists do, to present-day questions.
Just to answer Robert's question, yes, we do still. Although there are sometimes exceptions, and I see several of them in this room, and they can also, under the right circumstances, people who don't have strong science backgrounds, maybe even including myself, can be halfway decent science journalists with enough practice, and also, as Robert pointed out, with a keen understanding of how the scientific process works, what it really means, that this is a way of looking at the world that is, requires verification, is tentative, provisional by nature. A deep understanding of that process is the most important thing, and it's really helpful to have a science background in order to get that understanding, but it's not quite essential.
So have you seen, Dan, people who have been through science journalism programs be resources for other reporters who haven't gone through that background? Because I spend a lot of time with people who have been through general programs who need to be up to speed, and I'm wondering if there's a peer support possibility there.
Yeah, there is some, but we need more. I mean, one of the many destructive things that have come out of the sort of the disassembling of major metropolitan newspaper newsrooms is that this sort of community of learning from each other and just sort of floating from desk to desk, and the kind of consultation that would happen in the newsrooms that I grew up in professionally, that still to some extent exists at a few lucky places, but largely people now need to sort of find their communities online, and every time you do that, you run the risk of sort of missing out on the kind of almost accidental sort of kismet style sort of interactions that can occur in actual physical space. And so that is a concern. And, certainly a big part of the future of science journalism, we know, is going to be sort of a big messy mixture between science journalists, people who are specialists, like many people in this room, and many people who've been through my program and others, but also scientists who are scientists first, and maybe doing some writing on the side. We think training those people in journalistic practices is incredibly important. We've spent a lot of time working really hard on trying to do that, and we're not the only ones at NYU. And then thirdly would be general journalists who don't have a keen, a sort of a clear, for whom science is just sort of intimidating. And that's the weakest link in that sort of triad. And we need to do everything that we can to try to spread that information, and it's incredibly difficult to do. I mean, one of the reasons that science journalism has done okay, even in this crazily changed media landscape, is that other editors, other journalists are so intimidated by science that they're like, oh God, we have to get a science journalist on staff because it's too hard for anyone but a science journalist. Nobody really says that about, sports journalists, even though doing sports writing is difficult. But we have a kind of a special whamma jamma in science journalism that in some ways we benefited from, but it also creates a kind of a wall around our profession that is a real structural problem.
I would like to point out that universities are quite aware of this need for greater interdisciplinarity. And so within, for instance, Columbia University, there are different avenues for increasing the interaction between science and humanities. One is through specialized centers like the Center for Science and Society, which is trying to do these pulling together of disparate audiences. The second is through professional degree programs. I happen to teach in a Master of Public Administration in environmental science and policy, and what we strive to do is to find a student body that comes from disparate backgrounds, train them in basics of science so that they can go out and communicate between the scientists and policymakers, because there's really a step where there are several layers between those groups sometimes. And so in a way, they are trying to take on that same communication challenge that journalists have in taking complex science and translating it to the public. I would say that there are two very good resources for people looking for good science, people who can communicate that, or entities that can communicate that. One I mentioned before as professional societies. One example that I'm familiar with is the Ecological Society of America, that they have a public relations, public affairs office, and they can suggest scientists who are, shall we say, amenable to trying to communicate science to the public. They usually communicate to other specialists, but there are lots of people to be cultivated by journalists who have broad interests, have sympathy to communication to journalists, and yet can give a nice narrative. So I would somewhat counter Dan in the sense that there is no causal connection between the evidence and the narrative. It's wonderful to have both simultaneously. Get sources who can give you an overview, and you can test whether that conforms to the evidence that you uncover. And being able to have a scientist, a sort of a pocket scientist, who is a go-to person for a first cut of the significance of an event, for instance, or the history of the idea, is a nice grounding, but it's not the end point. It's part of that building of a picture.
Can I maybe
please.
Interject, I wouldn't presume to give specific advice to journalists, but I do think it's important, even as we're saying how important it is for journalists to know what the science is they're writing about, and to know what science is, that they need to realize that the audiences that they may be educating about what this particular science is may not have a grounding in what science itself is, right? So there's a kind of double pedagogy at work for science journalists that I think make them, kind of heroes of the moment in a certain way. I was really struck by the comment earlier about, journalism being under assault in similar but not identical terms to the way science is under assault. So that's something I think that has to be sort of figured into our trapdoors, and think out of that dilemma as well.
I just want to ask one. So I think we're a little bit. These resources are great. It's great that so many things are sort of scattered around and delivered. But one thing, Michael, you mentioned to me, which I was really struck by, and is certainly true. We are hopeful that people are spending time. Journalists maybe are spending time getting up to speed on the science. The scientists are spending a little time understanding the problems of communication, how to do it well. But Michael, what you said to me is you usually get somebody who's got 45 minutes to get up to speed on something that their general job is covering something else entirely. And you have to explain even what peer review is. What do you do in a moment like that?
Well, I think it's, from a scientist's perspective or from an advocate's perspective, it's making sure that the background and the perspective that someone is coming from, because the journalist is trying to get the story right. They're under a pretty significant time pressure to do so. Sometimes it's not even 45 minutes, and so it's just making sure that that they have what they need in the moment, and then going back and trying to figure out how to support them over the long term. I think there are the journalists can get ahead of that by cultivating sources, in advance. There is a thirst in the science community right now to inform the public. For a really long time, the conversation was around whether or not scientists should engage in public life, and a lot of navel gazing has taken place over the past several decades in the science community about that very question. And that's really shifted to not from whether to engage, but how to engage. And there's some really great science communicators that are doing fantastic work in bringing their peers along in informing the public and building relationships with journalists. And that can happen not just in New York, but anywhere in the country. You have land-grant research universities in every state. You have many resources out there, and lots of burgeoning programs to train scientists to communicate better. So then the general assignment reporter has someone to call who, if they don't know the answer, can point them to someone who does. And so that kind of infrastructure building is something that I think will go a long way to creating a more resilient system that resists spin.
I do think that you're absolutely right about that. It's actually generally easier now to get scientists to work with you on a story than it was 10 or 15 years ago, which is a very good thing on multiple levels, in part because journalists have less time, and so they don't have the time to be sort of go through the sort of wooing process of trying to get a source to work with them. There's another important benefit, I think, of the sort of the Trump effect and the sort of the larger secular trend that he's just amplifying, and that is that because we now have a president who just has no problem contradicting the weight of the evidence or our best description of reality, it's just not a thing for him to contradict that. A lot of journalists are now really recognizing the importance of data and evidence, because we're all even more in the fact-checking business than we ever have been in the past. And so that has been sort of a recognition for a lot of people that, hey, it actually is possible to show that this statement is contrary to our best understanding of reality. And where in the past, when we were sort of operating in a more sort of normal politics with sort of a general respect for evidence, but different ideologies, now that we're in the middle of something different, I do think that one of the real positives is that we've seen an explosion of data-centric journalism, many of it sort of calling BS on Trump or other figures of authority, and that is a really good thing. And we've seen that in the success of sites like Quartz and Vox and 538, and also the work, data-centric work of great traditional outlets like the Post and the Times. That is a really positive thing, and we need to encourage that.
I agree 1,000%. That's a super positive thing. Unfortunately, at the same moment, I think there is a huge kind of countervailing development that the public is less and less sure that any one truth exists. Absolutely. And I think that we can point lots of fingers here. I like to think in terms of Mark Twain once said that the novels of Sir Walter Scott caused the Civil War because the whites in the South got all involved in these fantasies of nobility. So what's doing it now, right? What are we reading in common, or what is this informed public reading in common? And I think search technology and Wikipedia, things like Wikipedia, are the things in common that we have. We can't blame a partisan press, right? The press has always been partisan in some sense, right? So there is something, sort of endemic to the frame, I think, in which journalism is stepping up. But our goals, in a sense, are becoming more harder and harder and harder. Yeah. I guess that's the post-truth, but I wouldn't blame Trump. I mean, I think he's coming from. We've always had a political system that values ignorance and innocence in a way, but now there seems to be a sort of more broader cultural embrace, maybe bubbling from these tools.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's now possible to sort of construct your own information reality, your own bubble. And just like those Southerners that got their view of history from reading Sir Walter Scott, you could, reading these sort of romances, you can construct, an alternative reality just from looking at Breitbart and the Daily Caller and get that affirmation you need. And so, I think that's a totally legitimate point, and it's part of this sort of atomization of media, again, this sort of deeper secular trend that Trump is to some extent accelerating, but mostly he's just taking advantage of this sort of underlying situation.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, it has come from the right and from the left. It's not a manifestation of one political ideology. We hear a lot about attacks on climate change scientists, but anti-GMO activists have been equally culpable in attacking scientists who work on bioengineering and filing incredibly invasive Freedom of Information Act requests that act as denial of service attacks, and calling them out in public, and then calling out the journalists and not just being a thorn in their side, but actually unfairly maligning journalists who write fairly about genetic modification. So there are lots of different interests out there that attack people who put forth messages that don't fit the worldviews that they have.
So did you want to add something? I'm sorry, did you want to add something?
Oh, I would just say that there are many more avenues now for fringe elements to be heard, but taking them seriously, on the one hand, recognizing that they're there, but focusing back on visions of the world that we want to have, I think, is one way to cut out some of the noise. That was one of the questions earlier. How do you have that central core of a story while trying to shut down some of the, or shut out some of the extraneous noise? And scientists have to do that with their data. They have to judge what is robust data set, and I think that it is something that they have been trained to do, and I agree that having visualization of data can be, having that skill is something that scientists are always striving for so that they can tell a complicated story in a more streamlined way. So that is my observation that sometimes it's best to be able to, for scientists at least, there's long tradition of being deeply engaged with individual projects, but being able to step back and give a more considered assessment of situation comes about through these increasingly large aggregations of robust communication. So from the individual scientist to their communication with journalists, vice versa, within professional organizations. And I have to point out that we've been talking primarily about the United States, but it's refreshing to see the journalism that is being carried about throughout the world, the science being communicated throughout the world. And I think that when we think about science and democracy, it is a good thing to see some positive special reports that come out from disparate sources around the world. So at least when I am feeling embattled by the deluge of information, it's fun to be able to see some of the special reports that are being produced. They're expensive, they're time-consuming, but they are getting done, whether it's within science or whether it's within journalism. So,
I think that the earlier point that you made, I just wanted to amplify that briefly, and that is that this is we talked about all the similarities between the scientific process and the reporting process, but one place where there's really a departure, I think, is that good scientists are really trained to ignore, dismiss assertions that are not based on data. Good journalists now in this era, we really don't have the luxury of ignoring those statements. Especially if the public policy is being made based on them. We sort of run to ignorance and try to bring light to it instead of doing what good scientists do, which is saying, well, that's just not interesting. It's not worth my time and attention. And this is a source of frequent misunderstanding, I think, between scientists and journalists, where scientists are like, well, why are you wasting your time writing about this? And a good journalist, at least in my view, will say, well, I'm writing about this because I want to show why it doesn't reflect the weight of the evidence. I want to put this in correct context and hopefully correct public misunderstanding. Lord knows that's really difficult to do in highly politicized issues for really interesting psychological reasons. But we need to keep engaging.
I want to come to the audience in just a minute, but Rob, I know you have to leave soon. I mean, you made a statement to me that armies are changed by the battles they fight. I wonder if you might like to share that or other thoughts before you have to head out.
To teach my first class, and what we're going to do in my first class is talk about how you deal with complex questions that come down in shades of gray. Do we shape the technology? Does the technology shape us? Well, the answer is a little bit of both, right? And you have to begin to sort of weigh those kinds of questions. But one thing that haunts me, two things that haunt me about the present situation. One is it's been a long time in coming, sometimes more than 50 years. I would say the war against the press goes back 50 years. It's reached a certain kind of crescendo now, but it goes back a long way. But almost everything we're dealing with, from politics to culture to technology, has been building for a while, and it's not going to go away immediately, however much we engage it today. We just have to think about that long-term frame of reference. I also think it's useful to think in the present about the future that might come out of the world that we're working our way through right now. It's been said that armies never leave the war in the same organization with which they started it. The Army is often changed by the war. Think about World War II. You know, there are a lot of horses in the U.S. Army on the eve of World War II. By the end of World War II, horses were not a big part of the battle plan in the same way. How will U.S. journalism be changed by its engagement with the Trump administration and all its outliers who attack and vilify journalism in all sorts of ways, and science journalism in particular? I'm not sure, but I think it's a great question to pick up, and I just want to salute everybody for doing such a good job, and stay strong.
Thank you. That seems like a great point. Well, yeah, thank you, Rob, because I know you have to leave. Thank you. So that seems like a great point to then come to your questions. No doubt you've been thinking about a lot of things while listening to many of the insights you've heard. Please come to either of these microphones, and I'll try to go back and forth. And please say who you are before you ask the question or make a quick statement. You were ready first.
Hello, hello?
It'll come on.
Hopefully they'll turn it on when they see you talking there.
Hi, I'm Jessica Siegel. I'm on the faculty at NYU. I am also a science and society intersection investigative reporter with a background at the Chicago Tribune way back. Dan, I was especially taken by your comment about the importance of having data drive the narrative rather than the narrative drive the data. As both a consumer reporter and also as a science journalist, I have encountered editors at all levels, both writing for the popular press and also even in the science narrative long-form space, that are really taken with story. And obviously you wouldn't have had to say it if it wasn't an issue. And I have had to, it's actually quite time-consuming to be batting back stories that people are saying, well, what about this and what about that? And then you really have to do all this investigation to come up with hardcore data deep into the database. Do you have any suggestions for what we as journalists, how we can handle that? And also for the entire panel, I do wonder if you have any thoughts or have studied how this affects the public understanding. It's an area that is especially rife in the consumer press, including the New York Times, which daily confuses correlation with causation, especially in their health pages. It's really astonishing. I keep a file of it, and it's almost every single piece that I'm surprised that we don't live to be 200, because the things that you eat and the exercise that you do can stop cancer in its track and make you live forever. So just double-barreled public understanding, what we can do about it, and Dan, the management and feeding of editors.
Right. Yeah. So Jessica's really hit on something really important that we deal with every day. A couple of things. The first is, you know, again, this is sort of a gift from the president. Thank you, Mr. President. And that is that the sort of call BS frame resonates now with editors more than it has in the past. So I have so many current and former students in the audience. It's a bad idea to single out one, but I will single out one, and she's not here, so this is good. Melinda Winter-Moyer has sort of made her career on not doing sort of the sort of fake call-out BS that you see sometimes in Slate that, you know, is sort of made fun of sometimes. But she has managed to sort of, you know, create a genre in the consumer mags that for stories that merge anecdote and data, but the data is always solid, and sort of the frame is what you think you know, you don't actually know. And that does appeal to editors. It carries a big risk, right? And that is sometimes made fun of with Slate, that, oh, well, you know, in their desperation to be counterintuitive, they're manipulating the data or the story. But if you find the right set of facts, that frame can actually be super effective with editors. And by necessity, it needs to be an evidence-based claim, needs to be an evidence-based sort of theme, because you're going against what people think. It needs to be argument-based. So that kind of argument-based journalism can be very effective in consumer publications, as long as you're really careful about the data.
Could you repeat that reporter's name so we can all be sure to follow her?
Oh, Yeah, she's great. Her name is Melinda Wenner Moyer, Moyer. Hi, Lindy, if you're watching.
And there was a question for the whole panel, I think you had as well, just to wrap that up on public understanding and how it may get confused.
It's a pleasure to meet another NYU faculty member, because I want to say education is the long, slow way to change the world. And that's what it's going to take. You know, both journalism and science are in this business, but so are a lot of other people. We all have to be responsible to step into the mission of educating the public around causation and correlation and everything else.
And critical thinking skills. The museum has an oversubscribed program now on helping young students distinguish between fake news and real news. And there are high school students clamoring to participate in that. So
Graduate students also.
Thank you very much.
Let me go to this side of the room.
Speaking of graduate students, hi. So I'm Kate Bredbenner, and I'm a graduate student here, and I'm also a science communicator on YouTube. Yay, the internet. So my question was a lot about this more data-driven journalism, because, you know, I love data. I'm a scientist. Data's my jam. But I wonder if everyone that's reading all of the new journalism pieces on data is being brought along. Does everyone seem to love the data, or is it kind of increasing this kind of division between, you know, the middle America people and the people in their cities with their data and their, you know, arguments on science, right? So I wondered if you had a feeling for how this data-driven science is affecting all of the people reading these pieces.
Yeah, I think that's. Does somebody else want to go first? I don't want. Okay. I think that's a really good point, and it's another trap, right? That many of the sites that I gave a shout out to, 538, Vox, Vice, Quartz, they're doing beautiful data centric work, but they, you know, if we did a sort of a reader survey of, you know, where they are ideologically, they would overwhelmingly be, you know, identified liberal Democrats, and so this is a risk. I do think that it's really, really important when you, in sort of the rush to do these call BS stories on people, that you check yourself and you make sure that your opinion, you know, your take rises from the data, rises from your best sense of the consensus, the scientific consensus, and it's a risk because it's very easy to do otherwise. You can cherry pick your data just the same way people cherry pick their news sources. The plus is that I see, you know, this is why metropolitan newspapers are so important, because they are really the last important non-ideological sources of information, and also the science press, the science specialized press to some extent. And I see metropolitan newspapers like Chicago Tribune, to some extent the Dallas Morning News still, LA Times, the Florida papers. I see them doing really important projects that are not just speaking only to those liberals. And so I think it's quite possible to do the kinds of stories that I'm putting on a pedestal here without just pandering to people's preconceived ideologies. And congratulations on building your brand, doing your communicating via YouTube, which is this is a really powerful way to communicate that scientists are discovering, and it's a powerful tool that in the wrong hands can be, you know, very misleading, and in the right hands can be super empowering and reach new communities. So use your power well.
absolutely, yeah. I would just add that data wouldn't exist without story. I don't think it'd be collected in the first place. One of the best projects to come out over the past year is the Data Refuge Project, which stemmed out of a lot of concern that data would become less accessible when you have people taking over agencies who don't accept the science. Then there's no reasons for them to leave it up. And the success of that project was to download terabytes of data and therefore render that kind of reduction in access obsolete. But as that movement was maturing, people started asking, well, how can we actually build support for data collection long term? And the consensus ended up being that we need to tell stories about why it's important to collect information and what information is collected already and how that impacts people's lives, so that people can see the link between satellites that NASA and NOAA put up into orbit and agricultural production and the ability to be able to forecast crop yields and all kinds of different things. And so there's impacts of data on every citizen in the United States and every non-citizen as well. And so journalists can help make those connections and tell those stories and make that real to people, so that there is more of a groundswell for the continued collection and accessibility of information. It becomes a very symbiotic relationship.
And I would add to that one can find data retrospectively, find information, find evidence that you didn't know was going to be useful. And so I just want to point out that much of the very earliest intimations of climate change came out of parson naturalists in England, having their diaries filled with the observations of the first spring flowers and such. And they didn't have the narrative of climate change. They didn't think about global warming. We need to think about the historical context. But in hindsight, now people are finding utility to points of information that they wouldn't have expected without that overarching new paradigm of climate change. So I am a firm supporter of basic science, and being able to tell the public the utility of basic science, of things that you might not see the utility of instantly, is very important for a robust understanding of creating that understanding or a new understanding of the natural world.
Just if I could have one quick additional way to keep narrative and data, adhered or complicating each other, I think increasingly we're going to need the stories behind data as AI techniques become more and more prevalent across different sectors of society. Telling the stories behind the training sets, the training data sets, is going to be a kind of crucial sort of site for reporting, I think, because too often these AI vendors take the good of data analytics as a given, and it's only going to be journalists and critics who look to see what the training data was to try and get a purchase on what that black box algorithm is that's operative.
Right, and that's something we haven't really talked about at all, but just to mention it, our role is not just to hold politicians accountable, and it's not just to serve readers with entertaining, interesting stories that teach them things that they don't know. It's also to hold scientists accountable. And we haven't really talked about that, but that includes, AI folks who think that AI is just an inherently good thing, regardless of application. It also, applies to genetic engineering, which has been wonderful for society in many ways, but also poses risks that are worth examining. And that's a really essential part of our role, that we shouldn't have a panel like this and not even at least mention it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nina Marin, and I got an undergrad degree in biology from NYU, and now I'm a lab technician there. So I'm like one of those people who got a degree in biology and doesn't know what to do with it yet. But my question is actually about more of the corruption of trust between like scientists and the public and journalism and the public. And I'm curious about what you think about future business models, because I know Dan mentioned this, that advertising revenue is not great on the internet, and so there isn't a lot of good funding for good journalistic investigation, and there's also kind of an erosion of good funding for good scientific investigation. And I think, the public is rightly skeptical of like what questions are being asked and what questions are being investigated based on where the funding is coming from. So I'm curious if you have any like optimistic perspectives about where the future of funding for both science and journalism could come from, that would kind of reinforce the trust between the public and those forces.
Can I add a bit here, Dan, before you
Yeah.
do, if you don't mind?
You're in
since-
charge.
Yeah. Well, but just to the business model question, a thing we didn't talk about, which I thought I might add from my perspective as both the editor of Scientific American and a person who has some publishing responsibilities also in the Nature Research Group, is there are a couple approaches you can take, and obviously we've already talked about a few models, but I'm sensitive to what you're saying there about people's trust based on where the funding's coming from. Where I work, the main funding comes from the readers. And advertising is quite nice to have, but a long time ago we made our peace with the fact that advertising was going away in print and changing digitally. And for that reason, the majority of the funding comes from the audience who cares most about it. So the funding is you or anybody here who happens to buy publications that you like the mission of and like the storytelling of. And I would add one other really quick thing to that is we talked a little earlier about taking the broad approach, so looking for lots more audience, going even broader. That makes you shallow in some ways, but still we do this. Some of us do that, and indeed, for instance, in my own publication, when I took over as editor-in-chief, we had about 1.5 million unique visitors a month. I get more than 8 million on average a month at Scientific American these days, just a few years later. That's not because we're doing clickbait and fancy things. We're still Scientific American from 1845 and still probably a little stodgy and things like that too, but the information's reliable and it's enjoyable and it's tailored to you who are reading. So you have two ways. You can go broad and you can pick up things like programmatic advertising to help all of us do that, or you can go deeper and you can really try to provide information that your audiences value. So I just wanted to add that to the question of business models, because I think that's important too. And there are lots of other things I know Dan will be very wise and add to.
No. I mean, what Mariette has done at Scientific American is just so impressive to sort of sustain this really crucial brand, and she's not only kept it going, but grown it, and it's a wonderful thing. It doesn't come without costs. Staffing can change. Various, you have to make difficult decisions about how your journalism is going to be produced and for whom. Those aren't the only options, going big or going more narrow. Of course, there's been a lot of experimentation with nonprofit models. They carry risks of their own, questions about their sustainability, et cetera, and about their actual responsiveness to the marketplace. If somebody's doing great journalism, but it's not at all responsive to the needs of the readership, then in the long run, is that something we even want to sustain? That's a tough question. And then also, there are lots of places experimenting with models where they're producing journalism, but their revenue actually comes from areas that are sort of divorced from their journalism. And that can succeed under the right circumstances. But maybe they're a membership organization. Maybe they sell products and they do journalism on the side. Again, that poses a whole series of risks and needs for firewalls. But these are all important experiments worth doing. This is we're still in the Gutenberg era, and the monks are in an uproar, and suddenly everybody's looking at these newfangled things called books, and information is flying around, and at a Gutenberg moment, we've got to try a million things, a million different models, and that's what we're doing.
Let's go back over to this side.
Hi, thank you everybody for an amazing panel. It's been really interesting. Lisa and Dan, you just sort of started to touch on the previous question what I wanted to bring up. So I spend a lot of my time, like I'm sure everybody does here, reading about all of the latest science and talking to scientists about all the newest things they're doing. And it's really fascinating and hopeful, but it's also quite terrifying sometimes. It's very unsettling. Science and technology are by their nature like very disruptive. And sometimes it can feel like, I wonder if some of the current public distrust or skepticism about science is because it feels like this group of people who are kind of pulling society in the direction they want to go in, and there's not as much involvement with people how they want their lives to be changed. I think a lot of us feel like we wish we spent less times on our phones, and we didn't really have a choice about that becoming part of our lives. So I guess I wonder, as we talk about science journalism and democracy, how the three of them can work together to kind of mitigate that fear a little bit, to keep science accountable, to make sure it serves the public good, and what role science journalists have in that, so that we're not just gee whiz championing everything they do. Because a lot of the changes that feel like they're on the horizon are things that maybe we're not, we don't have structures in place to really deal with those things yet.
That's all? Okay.
No pressure.
Just a thought.
Just the only thing, I mean, those are like cosmic questions that if we had the answer to them, we would be doing it already. But I'll tell you one thing that I do feel strongly about, and that is it's really easy to sort of open your lens too far as a working journalist and just sort of be in a constant state of existential crisis about the future and what's coming. And it is really important to think about the big picture. But it's also really important just to focus on the value of the work right now, because the work is really important. And if you don't feel your work is valuable this year of all years, then you really shouldn't be a journalist, because there's no year, maybe in the history of journalism, has the act of journalism been more important than it is right now in 2017. This is important work that we're doing. So yes, we have to think about these big secular trends. We have to open our lens wide and understand context and think about our own personal futures. But you know what? We also just need to do great work right now, because the great work is really important. It's essential to democracy.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bentley. I'm a PhD student doing science at NYU. So my question is about, I guess, the dissemination of all of the science journalism that happens, and with things like Twitter and the internet, everything gets around very fast and it gets skewed very fast. Someone did a sort of joke article where the title was about one thing, but the article was about something else, and it was still shared very widely because nobody reads the articles anymore.
Yeah.
They just read the titles, and that's a very scary thing to me. So I was wondering, how do you guys toe the line to make sure that your title is interesting enough that people follow it, but you're not jumping to these really overarching conclusions, because more often than not, a lot of the science is still in the air about some things, and you can't come to this conclusion that, like, this snowstorm will hit and it will be 30 feet, and then when it doesn't, everyone doesn't trust science because, science isn't always 100% predictable, things like that. So I know that's kind of a broad thing, but sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to answer your question. You guys. All right, I'll answer it.
I'll just point out that writing titles is an art that people have struggled with for a very long time. And in education, I can tell you that if you teach to the lowest common denominator, you'll never teach anything. And so you have to have trust in your audience that it will indeed. And I don't speak as a journalist because I am not one, but as an academic, you pick the title you can that is reflective of the content, and certainly hope that people go beyond that, because that's the whole point of communicating.
Yeah, I mean, scientists often worry that they're going to be quote unquote dumbing down their research by making it more accessible, and we say, no, you're making it more clear. You're not dumbing it down. And so it's not necessarily answering the question about how to get people to read the articles, but we need to be comfortable with the idea that we can clearly and more effectively communicate. Responding to the previous question also, that it's important for scientists and journalists to listen to their audiences and the people that they're trying to solve problems for or inform, so that projects can be more collaborative as well. And I think you engage people more when they feel invested in it, and they're more likely to read an article or collaborate on a scientific project if they feel like they're part of the conversation.
there's really nothing more infuriating to me than that dumbing down business. A good journalist doesn't dumb down anything, and a good journalist can be fair at any length, can write about particle physics in 300 words if necessary. It's not going to be complete. It's not going to be fully contextual, but it sure as hell can be fair, at any length. And I didn't have the room to be fair is never an appropriate excuse for a journalist. And I'm not going to talk about my research because it'll just be dumbed down is never an appropriate excuse for a scientist.
And that's why there are increasing number of boot camps out there getting scientists to think about the elevator pitch they could make about their research, but also getting the communication going between science and broader society. I do want to point out that scientists are very eclectic bunch, and so just the same with this idea of audience. Multiple scientists, multiple goals, same as with science, with society. So having monolithic categories is not terribly helpful.
I'd just like to jump in real quick with a question from the live stream. This is from Anne Guy, who is an independent science communications professional. She says that she writes a lot of stories and press releases to help universities and nonprofit research groups promote notable findings. And she sees quotes and narrative that she created used verbatim sometimes in news articles. As a comms person, yay, she says. But she thinks that this shallow journalism is worrisome. She'd rather have even the most time-stressed writer take 10 minutes to call the scientist sources, to verify and probe. So how can, her question is, science communications and journalists best work together in the current environment so this doesn't happen? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, so this is a critical problem. It is not a new problem. It's one of the oldest problems we have in science journalism. There's a school of thought in science journalism that says it's okay to lift quotes from press releases. It is not okay to lift quotes from press releases without attribution. I do not think that is okay, and I wouldn't employ anybody in my program who thought that it was okay. And yet there are a significant number of journalists who think it's okay to essentially appropriate the work of science communicators without attribution. I strongly disagree. It's unethical. It sets you up at risk for publishing mistakes, and it drives down public trust, and we should not do it. I have no easy solution for how to root out those journalists to do it, except one of the nice things about Twitter has many evil things, but one of the nice things about Twitter is that it's a kind of a shame sphere sometimes within journalism that can be really useful and really important to sort of call people out when they do that. And I'm for that, as long as we do it, in a respectful way. By the way, don't follow my Twitter feed because I think of it as a sort of a psychological outlet for stress, it's where I express my existential angst. So don't follow me.
I think I'm getting the sign that we're about out of time, which is a real shame because it's a wonderful conversation and I really appreciate it. I just maybe want to leave everybody with the thought that if Carl said, science is at the heart of humanity's search for truth, and if one of the ways we get at that truth is the work of journalists, I also wanted to leave with you what Dan had said, which is do great work right now. Could I all thank the panelists who did really great work right now?
Can we get in one plug or one additional question?
Go for it.
Sorry to cut your break a little shorter, but one thing we didn't get to that I did want to bring up was just to be wary of pundits or politicians who say we shouldn't talk about evidence when disasters are unfolding, as if it's not important why your town is being flooded or why the wildfire is happening or why the mass shooting has happened, that's the right time to talk about why the CDC has stopped research on gun violence. That's the right time to talk about long-term planning, flood insurance programs, disclose the fact that the Trump administration has pushed out delayed plans to inform communities about what chemicals are in chemical plants that are now burning. So, so please resist that temptation to have this reverence where you don't talk about things at the very moment they should be talked about.
It's a really
Thank you
good
again.
point.